In the Middle Ages, before your wristwatch, before even the grand town hall clocks that would one day regulate the life of a city, time was measured in ways both fragile and frustratingly imprecise. If you had lived in Europe between the 9th and 12th centuries, your entire life would have been dictated not by the steady tick of machine, but by the solemn rhythm of monks, their chants, and their bells. Time was not a universal agreement then. It was local, it was flexible, it was entirely dependent on the endurance of men in drafty cloisters who kept the world moving forward with candles, bowls of dripping water, and sleepless nights. These were the monks who counted minutes, though they did not call them minutes, for minutes, as we know them, were not yet standardized. They divided their days into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour was not 60 minutes long, as we know it, but simply a portion of the day or night, stretching and shrinking with the seasons. In summer, hours were long and lazy. In winter, they contracted into something brief and urgent. Imagine waking in a monastery cell. The air is cold, your blanket thin. Outside, the world is dark, darker than modern cities ever know, because there is no glow of lamps, no electricity humming in the distance. The only signal that it is time to rise is a heavy iron bell, pulled by a fellow monk whose life is devoted to making sure the day begins correctly. He may have spent the last hours monitoring a water clock, watching carefully as the level dripped down to its mark, or perhaps he simply relied on the stars. Either way, his single responsibility was to make sure everyone woke up at the appointed hour, though the hour itself was a shifting concept. The monk's role as timekeeper was both boring and vital. His mistakes echoed through the monastery. If he rang the bell too late, prayers would be rushed, meals disrupted, and the abbot displeased. If he rang too early, bleary-eyed monks might mutter disapproval, but worse, their fasting schedules could be thrown into chaos. In a world where religious observance structured every moment of the day, time was not a suggestion. It was salvation. The simplest tools were water and fire. Water clocks, known since antiquity, consisted of bowls with small holes at the bottom. As water drained, marks indicated the passage of time. But water freezes in winter, evaporates in summer, and leaks when pots crack. 1 inattentive moment, one drip too fast or too slow, and the entire monastery schedule could fall into disorder. Then there were candle clocks, long candles marked with lines, sometimes with small nails inserted, so they would fall with a faint clink when the wax melted to a certain point. In theory, these were precise. In practice, they were treacherous. Candles burned faster in drafts, slower in damp air, and sometimes went out altogether. A monk might stare at the candle for hours, praying for it to behave, his own sense of fatigue blurring the already uncertain passage of time. Sundials, too, were employed, but these were of little use in northern winters, when clouds smothered the sky and the sun vanished before supper. And so, once again, human vigilance filled the gaps. There were monks whose job was simply to sit awake in the night and watch, to wait, to listen to the silence and judge when the time for matins had arrived. It was thankless work, and yet it gave monasteries immense authority. To control the bells was to control time itself. Villagers living near monasteries often used the ringing as their own clock. If the monastery bells tolled for prime, then farmers knew it was time to begin their labor. If the bells tolled for vespers, it was time to put tools away. The monastery was not simply a spiritual guide, but the literal heartbeat of daily life. But think of the toll this took on the timekeepers themselves. Imagine being assigned to night duty, week after week, forced to resist sleep while others rested. In winter, the hours of darkness stretched long, and the gap between compline and matins could feel endless. The monk in charge of keeping watch might shuffle back and forth to stay awake, reciting psalms under his breath, or stare into the flickering flame of a candle, watching wax drip as slowly as the hours themselves. This human element, fragile, sleepy, fallible, meant that time in the Middle Ages was elastic. Entire monasteries drifted by half hours or more, their rhythms quietly diverging from one another. A bell ringing in one valley might sound long before or after its counterpart in another, yet no one thought of this as strange. Time was not a mathematical grid across the earth. It was a local contract between monks, bells, and the sky. And so, life bent to fit time, not the other way around. Meals followed the prayers, not the clock. Work began when the bell rang, not at 7:30 sharp. There was a patience, an acceptance, even a dullness in this arrangement. But there was also something profound. Time was holy, and its keepers, however tired, served as intermediaries between heaven and earth. If the monasteries had failed at this task, the ripple effects would have been enormous. Agriculture, fasting, and feast days depended on reliable timekeeping. Pilgrims traveling across Europe oriented themselves by monastery bells. Courts and markets, often held near church grounds, began when clerics declared the hour. Without the monks, the fragile thread of medieval order might have frayed altogether. It is easy to dismiss them now, these nameless, drowsy men who counted hours with dripping wax and dripping water. Yet their dedication was nothing less than the scaffolding on which medieval society rested. They were, in a sense, the living clocks of Europe, and without them, time itself might have unraveled into chaos. By the 13th century, the monastery bells still ruled the rhythms of prayer and work, but their grip on time was beginning to loosen. The very success of Europe's growing towns and trade networks created a new hunger. People wanted time to be predictable, transferable, and above all impartial. A farmer might tolerate the vagueness of hours that stretched and shrank with the seasons, but a merchant shipping goods across long distances could not. Markets opened at different hours in different towns. Fairs ran according to ecclesiastical calendars that drifted, and traveling clerks often found themselves disoriented. In an age when commerce was tying Europe together, time itself needed to be reimagined. It began, as so many medieval revolutions did, in the workshops of inventors whose names have mostly been forgotten. By the late 1200s, rudimentary mechanical clocks appeared in Europe. These were not small objects you could place on a table. They were enormous contraptions of iron gears, driven by weights and regulated by Virgin Foley escapements. Installed in church towers, these machines did not tick seconds. They struck hours. Loud, commanding, unignorable. Imagine a town square in northern Italy around 1300. The bell of a new tower clock tolls across the roofs, echoing into fields where peasants pause, startled. For the first time, the hour is no longer decided by the sleepy judgment of a monk in a cloister. It is measured by iron teeth and gears, consistent and impartial. The bell no longer waits for the stars or the dripping candle. It rings when the mechanism commands it. At first, these clocks coexisted uneasily with monastic systems. Monks still rose at canonical hours, but their bells began to be challenged by civic towers. Townsfolk, hearing the new clock strike, might mutter that the monastery was late again. The authority of monks as keepers of time was no longer unquestioned. This shift was not just mechanical. It was philosophical. For centuries, time had been a sacred rhythm ordered by the divine. Days flowed according to prayers, fasts, and feasts. But mechanical clocks introduced something unsettling, a time that was secular, civic, and unbending. The bell in the town square did not care about matins or vespers. It rang for merchants opening their stalls, for judges convening courts, for city guards changing watch. In a subtle but profound way, power was moving. The hours were leaving the cloister, where they had been guarded for centuries, and entering the streets. By the 14th century, disputes even arose between churches and civic authorities about whose bell was correct. In Milan, the mechanical clock in the town tower struck at one time, while the cathedral bell tolled at another. Citizens complained of confusion. Whose time was real, sacred or civic? Perhaps the greatest irony was that the monks, who had for centuries divided their lives into elastic hours, now found themselves pressured to conform to precise intervals. Once, an hour of prayer could stretch or shrink with the seasons. Now, an hour was a fixed quantity, declared by machinery. This did not happen overnight. Many monasteries resisted, but the world beyond their walls no longer revolved around the flexible divisions of canonical hours. Merchants wanted meetings at the third hour, meaning precisely the third striking of the civic bell. Sailors wanted to depart at noon, not merely when the sun seemed high. Judges expected trials to begin at set hours, not after terce. The machinery of law, commerce, and navigation demanded something new. For the monks, this must have felt like a quiet humiliation. For generations, they had been humanity's clocks. They had stayed awake through the long nights, endured the drips of candles and bowls of water. to preserve the sacred order of time. And now, a machine did their work more consistently and without exhaustion. Yet monasteries did not disappear from timekeeping. In fact, many abbots ordered mechanical clocks of their own, often adorning cloisters with elaborate devices. But the monopoly was broken. Villages no longer needed to listen for monastery bells. They could trust the iron voice of the civic tower. By the 15th century, Europe was awash with mechanical clocks. Paris alone had dozens, their bells competing in the morning air. Towns competed to build the largest, most impressive, most reliable machines. A new kind of civic pride was born, measured in hours. And slowly, inexorably, life itself began to change. Workdays were scheduled more rigidly. Meetings became punctual. Even sleep was altered as bells intruded into the night, shattering the natural rhythms of darkness. The age of the monks' elastic hours was ending. The age of minutes, cold, precise, and universal, was dawning. By the 15th century, bells were ringing everywhere. Monastery bells, civic tower bells, and even household bells, each striking its own rhythm. But there was a problem. Mechanical clocks, for all their brilliance, were not perfect. Their gears slipped. Their weight stretched ropes. They lost time in rain and gained it in frost. And since no two towns set their clocks in quite the same way, Europe was filled with a strange cacophony. 1,000 voices of iron, all disagreeing about what hour it was. If you traveled 20 miles from one city to the next, you might discover that noon arrived half an hour earlier there. If you asked two merchants to meet you at the 6th hour, you had to clarify. 6th hour by the town clock, the monastery bell, or the merchant guild's private timepiece. The monks had once held a monopoly on uncertainty. Now uncertainty multiplied. This era of local time produced an almost comical landscape. In London, the clock at St. Paul's Cathedral struck slightly differently than the one at Westminster. In Paris, district clocks told their own hours, and villagers outside town still followed the rhythms of monastery bells, sometimes hours off from their urban neighbors. What we consider a single, universal moment, 9 a.m. sharp, did not exist. Instead, there were countless 9 o'clock a.m.s, each belonging to its own bell tower. Imagine confusion for travelers, merchants, and diplomats. Meetings went awry. Court cases started late. Ship departures were missed. And yet, people adapted. Just as peasants once trusted monastery bells, now they learned to orient themselves to the nearest tower. The idea that time could be unified, standardized, and shared across distances was not yet obvious. That revelation would come later, with consequences the monks could never have imagined. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the keeping of time shifted into the hands of city councils, guilds, and governments. Monks still rang their canonical hours, but civic bells carried greater authority. Public officials argued about how often clocks should be calibrated. Astronomers were consulted. Sundials were still checked against machines. In some towns, officials literally climbed towers with hourglasses to verify the machinery. This bureaucratic layer of timekeeping might seem dull, but it was revolutionary. The idea that time could be regulated by decree, that a council could decide the true hour, marked a turning point. For the first time, time itself was treated as a public resource, like water or roads, requiring oversight. And yet, even as their monopoly dissolved, the monks' influence lingered. The very structure of daily hours, morning prayers, midday rest, evening reflection, still shaped civic time. Mechanical clocks were often built in monasteries first, then copied in cities. The tone of bells, solemn, measured, echoing, remained rooted in religious ritual. In a sense, the monks had trained Europe to think of time as something that must be kept guarded and obeyed. Without centuries of monastic discipline, the mechanical revolution of time might not have been so easily embraced. The true unification of hours, however, would not arrive until much later. The 17th century saw refinements, pendulum clocks, more accurate escapements, and greater synchronization. But still, every town had its own noon. It was not until the 19th century, with the advent of trains and telegraphs, that Europe and America faced the impossible fact. Local time was chaos. Railway timetables demanded precision. Telegraphs transmitted information instantly, but what good was a message if 3 o'clock in one town was 3:20 in another? The very forces of modernity force humanity to ask the same question that had haunted monks for centuries. What time is it really? And so, standard time zones were born. Noon was no longer when the sun was highest in your town. Noon was a coordinated agreement, enforced across regions. It was a bureaucratic triumph, but also a spiritual loss. The intimate, local hours of the monks had been replaced by the cold regularity of Greenwich Mean Time. Yet even today, in an age of atomic clocks and digital precision, something of the monks' world lingers. The church bell still tolls in villages, announcing hours that no one strictly needs. Cathedrals still mark canonical times with ritual. And when you glance at your wristwatch, you are part of a lineage that stretches back to those weary monks, watching candles drip and water bowls empty, struggling to keep the rhythm of the day. Their work was tedious. It was fragile. It was boring. But it was also the seed of the global order of time we live in now. Without their quiet devotion, we might still be stumbling through the dark, asking one another whether it was time yet to rise, to work, or to pray. If you had lived in the ancient world, or even well into the 19th century, you would not have thought of salt as an ordinary kitchen afterthought. To you, it would have been as precious as oil is today, a substance without which life itself would unravel. It preserved your food, flavored your meals, treated your wounds, and symbolized wealth and divine favor. Wars were fought for it, cities were built around it, and rulers taxed it relentlessly. Salt is everywhere now, scattered carelessly across tables and diners, dissolving unnoticed in soups. But in a time before refrigeration, salt was survival. Without it, meat rotted, fish spoiled, and entire armies could not march. Without it, bread lost its savor and life itself seemed bland. In medieval Europe, the poor sometimes lived their entire lives tasting nothing but bread, porridge, and, on rare days, a sprinkle of salt. That sprinkle was no small luxury. Let us begin in the Roman world. Rome's soldiers were not only paid in coin, they were sometimes given salt as part of their compensation. The word salary itself comes from salarium, the allowance for purchasing salt. The Roman roads that stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean were not simply for marching legions. Many doubled as salt routes, connecting inland cities to coastal sources. Imagine a Roman caravan moving inland from the Adriatic, wagons creaking under the weight of salt bricks carved from evaporation pans. These bricks glittered faintly in the sun, dull white, but more valuable than silver in the right markets. As they rolled into towns, markets buzzed with anticipation. Salt determined whether households could cure their pork for winter or watch it rot. It meant the difference between survival and hunger in the cold months. And yet, even as salt was universally needed, its sources were unevenly distributed. Some regions sat atop vast deposits. Others had nothing. This imbalance gave rise to a trade web that spanned continents. North African caravans carried salt across the Sahara in slabs as heavy as men, stacked on camels in shimmering lines that vanished into the horizon. Along these routes, entire kingdoms rose. The Mali Empire, for example, enriched itself on the salt-for-gold trade, where one white brick could be worth its weight in shining metal. But rulers understood quickly that necessity breeds revenue. Wherever salt could not be easily obtained, it became the perfect item to tax. From ancient China to medieval France, the salt tax was both despised and unavoidable. In China, the imperial salt monopoly was one of the most enduring institutions in history. For centuries, dynasties controlled salt production and distribution, ensuring a steady flow of income to the treasury. A peasant could ignore many luxuries, but not salt. The state knew this. Each grain sprinkled on food carried with it the faint taste of imperial control. France, too, relied heavily on the gabelle, the salt tax that became infamous for its cruelty. Different regions paid different rates, and smugglers flourished, carrying contraband salt through forests and across rivers in the dead of night. For many French peasants, the gabelle was more burdensome than almost any other levy. It was hated so deeply that during the French Revolution, salt tax collectors were among the first symbols of royal oppression to be targeted. And yet, behind all this grand history lay monotonous, grinding labor. Salt workers lived lives that were anything but glamorous. In coastal salt pans, men and women trudged barefoot through brine, raking crystals beneath the blazing sun, their skin cracked and burned by salt's caustic sting. Inland, Miners hacked at rock salt with picks, hauling out heavy chunks from suffocating caverns lit only by flickering lamps. Their lives were short, their bodies worn. Few songs celebrated them. And yet, without their labor, the entire fabric of medieval and early modern life would have collapsed. For every king who grew rich on salt taxes, thousands of anonymous workers carried brine, boiled seawater, or scraped crystals from stone. Their boredom built empires. Salt was not only survival, it was sacred. In Judaism, covenants were sealed with salt, a symbol of purity and permanence. In Christianity, believers were called the salt of the earth, a metaphor for incorruptibility. Hindu rituals, too, made use of salt as a purifying element. To share salt with someone was to bind yourself to them in trust. To spill it, on the other hand, was an ill omen, which is why we still toss a pinch over our shoulders today. Thus salt was both utterly ordinary and eternally symbolic, a contradiction that kept it present in the most boring corners of kitchens and the loftiest chambers of kings. By the late Middle Ages, salt was no longer just a household necessity or a sacred symbol. It had become a lever of power. Kings and emperors discovered that controlling salt meant controlling people, and they used it ruthlessly. Every loaf of bread, every slab of cured pork, every fish barrel in the market depended on it. That made salt the perfect candidate for monopolies and taxes, for it was a rare commodity you could not live without. And so, throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, rulers tightened their grip. Salt became not just food, but politics. In France, the infamous gabelle was one of the most resented taxes in history. Instituted in the 14th century and surviving in some form until the 20th, it divided the kingdom into regions with wildly unequal rates. Some provinces, the so-called pays-exempts, paid almost nothing. Others were crushed under heavy levies. This created a bizarre patchwork of salt economies. A villager in Brittany might pay a fraction of what his cousin in Anjou paid. Naturally, this bred smuggling. Entire families took up the trade, carrying sacks of contraband salt under cloaks, hidden in barrels, or strapped to horses. Faux sonneurs, false salt sellers, became folk heroes in some places, while salt inspectors were despised. The penalties were brutal. Smugglers caught in the act faced imprisonment, branding, even execution. Yet the trade flourished. The more the crown tried to tighten its grip, the more salt seeped through the cracks. By the 18th century, historians estimate that millions of pounds of illegal salt flowed through France each year. The gabelle became not just a tax, but a symbol of tyranny, feeding the fires of resentment that erupted in 1789. On the other side of the world, China perfected the art of state-controlled salt. The imperial monopoly, established as early as the Tang dynasty, remained one of the empire's most dependable sources of revenue. Unlike France's chaotic patchwork, China's system was methodical, bureaucratic, and ruthlessly efficient. Salt wells, pans, and transport routes were tightly controlled by the state. Licensed merchants purchased salt certificates, guaranteeing distribution through official channels. Smuggling existed. It always does. But the scale of the monopoly ensured a steady flow of wealth to the throne. Entire dynasties balanced their budgets on salt. But this efficiency came at a human cost. Peasants often bore inflated prices, and corruption among salt officials was endemic. Records describe bribes, forged permits, and violent clashes between smugglers and inspectors. For all its order, the system bred quiet resentment, simmering beneath the surface of Chinese society for centuries. What did smuggling actually look like? Forget the romanticized vision of daring adventurers. Salt smuggling was tedious, dangerous, and often deadly. In France, peasants carried small bundles of contraband hidden under their clothing, trudging through forests at night. If caught, they faced confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. Entire villages sometimes conspired together, sharing risks and profits. Women often played a central role, smuggling salt concealed in skirts or market baskets. In China, gangs of smugglers traveled in riverboats, evading inspectors at checkpoints. Violence was common. Smuggling networks became so entrenched that in some provinces, they effectively rivaled the state in power. In Italy, especially Venice, salt was central to diplomacy and trade. Smuggling undermined state monopolies, but was also winked at, tolerated when politically convenient, cracked down on when the treasury ran dry. Salt smugglers lived in shadows, but they were never just criminals. They were the inevitable byproduct of states trying to control what could not be fully contained: the daily need for flavor, preservation, and life itself. Salt was not only taxed, it was weaponized. Armies destroyed salt works to cripple enemies. During sieges, cutting off access to salt was as devastating as blocking grain. Without salt, soldiers' meat spoiled, rations dwindled, and morale collapsed. In 1556, during one of France's internal wars, armies deliberately burned salt pans along the Atlantic coast, devastating local economies. Centuries earlier, Chinese generals had done the same, poisoning wells or seizing salt mines to starve enemy forces. Salt was not glamorous, but it was devastatingly effective as a tool of control. By the early modern period, resentment over salt reached a boiling point. In France, hatred of the gabelle became so universal that it united peasants, artisans, and intellectuals alike. Philosophers mocked it, peasants cursed it, smugglers risked their lives against it. When the French Revolution broke out, one of the first acts of the National Assembly was to abolish the tax. It was not just a fiscal reform. It was a symbolic strike at the old regime. Elsewhere, too, salt fueled resistance. In India, the British salt tax became a symbol of colonial oppression. Centuries after monks first rang their bells to measure hours, Gandhi would march to the sea in defiance, scooping up salt to challenge an empire. The cycle was the same. Wherever rulers tried to monopolize what people could not live without, resistance inevitably followed. Salt once commanded armies, toppled kingdoms, and stirred revolts. It was a lifeline of cities, the treasure of merchants, the target of every king's tax collector. But today, you can buy an entire bag for the price of a few coins, spilling it carelessly on your kitchen counter. What happened? The answer is not dramatic. It is boring and all the more fascinating for it. The mighty empire's salt was undone not by war or rebellion, but by science, industry, and quiet abundance. For thousands of years, salt's most important role was preservation. Without it, meat, fish, and dairy spoiled within days. Armies could not march. Sailors could not voyage. Cities could not store food through winter. But the 19th and 20th centuries brought inventions that quietly dethroned it. Refrigeration changed everything. At first, ice houses and ice boxes, and eventually electric refrigerators, allowed households to preserve food without brine. Salted pork, once the staple of armies, gave way to fresh cuts chilled in ice-cool cars. Dried fish barrels, once stacked in ports from Lisbon to Stockholm, were replaced by shipments of frozen catch. The entire economy of preservation shifted. Canning added another blow. In the early 19th century, Nicholas Appert's discovery that sealed boiled jars kept food safe for months revolutionized supply chains. Soldiers in Napoleon's armies could carry tins instead of barrels of salted meat. Later, industrial canning scaled this up, bringing preserved vegetables, soups, and fish to every household. Salt remained, but no longer as a monopoly of survival. It became optional. As salt's status as a preservative declined, industry found other uses for it. Chemical production, glassmaking, and later chlor-alkali industries consumed vast amounts of salt. By the 20th century, salt was mined and processed at unprecedented scales, becoming a raw material rather than a delicacy. Rock salt mines, vast caverns stretching for miles, produced thousands of tons daily. Brine wells were drilled, evaporated, and refined by machines rather than barefoot laborers under the sun. Salt was no longer a luxury parceled out in blocks, but a bulk commodity shipped by rail and truck. In this transformation, salt lost its mystique. To a medieval peasant, salt was a treasure. To a modern worker in a chemical plant, it was dust on the floor. With abundance came the collapse of monopolies. No government could plausibly restrict or heavily tax something now produced at industrial scale. The French gabelle, hated for centuries, was formally abolished in 1945. China's salt monopoly lingered longer, but its importance waned as industrialization spread. By the late 20th century, salt taxes were anachronisms, relics of a world where scarcity had been power. What had once been a cornerstone of treasuries became insignificant. No modern revolution would rise over the price of salt. The mineral that had once driven rebellion was demoted to the spice aisle. And yet, salt never entirely vanished from culture. It lingers in language. Worth is salt, salt of the earth, salty tears. It lingers in ritual. Orthodox Christians still bless salt at baptisms. Hindus still use it in sacred ceremonies. In Japan, sumo wrestlers still purify their ring with salt before every match. We no longer fear famine when salt runs short, but we still scatter a pinch over our shoulders when it spills. The superstition echoes a time when losing salt really was misfortune, when each grain carried the weight of survival. Stand in a modern supermarket, staring at shelves of salt, coarse, fine, iodized, flavored, pink Himalayan in sleek jars. It looks endless, ordinary. But behind each grain lies a history of caravans across deserts, of smugglers under moonlight, of monks boiling brine, of kings bleeding their subjects for taxes. Salt ruled not by drama but by necessity, by the dull fact that no one could live without it. And when necessity disappeared, its empire collapsed quietly. The world moved on. Salt remained. Salt's story is a story of power hidden in boredom. It was never glamorous. It was always mundane. And yet, in its simplicity, it shaped empires, sparked revolts, and whispered through rituals that still touch our lives today. Now, it lies in a shaker on your table, waiting to be pinched between your fingers. Ubiquitous, invisible, forgotten. But if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear the camel caravans crossing the Sahara, the toll of the bell summoning smugglers to a midnight path, the hiss of brine boiling in medieval pans. The taste is ordinary. The history is vast. When people imagine ancient Egypt, they see the pyramids rising against a golden sky, or statues of kings carved into stone, eternal and unmoving. But those monuments did not spring up by magic. They were built by laborers, organized by overseers, and, most invisibly of all, recorded by scribes. The scribes were the men with reed pens behind their ears, hunched over papyrus scrolls, scratching neat lines of hieratic script under the desert sun. They were the keepers of numbers, the guardians of records, and the human calculators of a world without machines. Their work was not glamorous. But without it, the pyramids would have collapsed before the first stone was laid. In pharaonic Egypt, writing was power. Most of the population was illiterate. Farmers could plow and harvest. Stonecutters could carve and drag. Priests could chant, but only scribes could write. They learned their craft in special schools called houses of life, memorizing signs, copying texts, and practicing until their hands cramped. Their tools were simple: a palette with 2 cakes of ink, black for everyday text, red for headings or corrections, and a reed brush. Yet, with these tools, they could command the labor of thousands. A single scribe might hold the rolls that listed every worker on a pyramid project, who had reported for duty, who was sick, who had died, who had fled. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every measure of grain distributed to the workers passed through their hands in the form of neat columns of numbers. The scribe was not a laborer. His hands were clean, his back unbent, but his authority was absolute. A worker might sweat in the quarry all day, but if his name was missing from the scribe's roll, he would go hungry. Think of the pyramid of Khufu at Giza, built with millions of blocks of limestone. Behind every block was paperwork. Somewhere in a shaded chamber, a scribe marked down how many men hauled it, how much food they were given, how long it took. Each block was a line in a ledger. The work was monotonous. Lists of rations, lists of deliveries, lists of tools issued and returned, pages of barley tallies, endless calculations of bricks and baskets. The modern world remembers the grandeur of the pyramids, but the scribes remembered only numbers, scratched until their hands blistered. Yet their boredom kept chaos at bay. Without accurate records, bread would not arrive at the workers' camps. Without bread, men would desert. Without men, stones would remain in the quarry. The pharaoh's eternal tomb depended on ledgers as much as on levers. For a young man, becoming a scribe was a dream. Be a scribe, said Egyptian wisdom texts, for no scribe is ever a slave. Unlike farmers, they did not bend under plow. Unlike soldiers, they did not risk death in foreign lands. Their weapon was ink, their armor papyrus. But the life was not easy. Training took years. Copying text was grueling. Masters beat students who erred. And the job itself meant long hours in stuffy offices, hunched over rolls of papyrus. writing the same words again and again. So many loaves issued, so many jars received. A life of monotony, but also one of privilege, for scribes stood just below priests and nobles in the Egyptian hierarchy. When we walk through Egypt's ruins today, we see walls covered in hieroglyphs, prayers, dedications, records of kings' deeds. But most of the writing that sustained Egypt never survived. The ledgers of daily life, the boring lists of barley and beer, have long since crumbled. Only fragments remain, found in the workman's village at Deir el-Medina or in scraps of papyrus preserved by chance. Yet from these fragments we glimpse the true engine of Egyptian civilization, paperwork. A pyramid was not just a monument of stone, but of ink. Every brick was counted, every loaf of bread tabulated, every laborer's absence noted in stern handwriting. The pyramids stand as monuments of stone, but their true foundations were bread and beer. Without daily rations, thousands of workers would have starved, deserted, or revolted. And so, behind every block of limestone hauled across the desert, there was a scribe, reed pen in hand, tallying the calories that kept Egypt's workforce alive. In Egypt, wages were not paid in coin but in food. Bread and beer were the staples of life, and they were meticulously accounted for. A skilled worker might receive 10 loaves and 2 jars of beer per day. A lower laborer might get half that. Extra rations might be given for dangerous tasks, cutting stone in dark, suffocating quarries, or ferrying blocks on the Nile. The scribes kept track of all this. Each worker's portion was recorded in rolls, marked off day by day. If a worker fell ill, his rations were reduced. If he died, his family might receive a partial allowance until his name was struck off the list. Imagine standing in line at dawn, waiting for your daily bread. A scribe sits on a low stool, papyrus across his knees, reciting names. If he nods, you receive your loaf. If he frowns, you go hungry. The power of life and death lay not in the pharaoh's hands, but in the records of the scribes. From these records, historians have uncovered one of the most remarkable facts of Egyptian history: the first recorded labor strike. Around 1150 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who built the royal tombs, stopped work. Why? Their rations were late. The workers marched to the local temple, sat down, and refused to lift another tool until they were fed. The scribes' ledgers show the dispute: missing bread deliveries, delayed beer shipments, complaints piling up. Eventually, officials scrambled to supply the workers, and the strike ended. It was not revolution, but it was a warning. Even in a kingdom where the pharaoh was a living god, paperwork mattered more than divine titles. If the ledgers failed, so did the kingdom. This constant stream of records gave scribes enormous quiet power. They were not kings or generals, but they were indispensable. They controlled access to food, to tools, to official recognition. A mason could carve a block, but without a scribe's notation, it might never be counted. A farmer could deliver grain, but if it was not recorded, he might be accused of theft. The scribe's pen was sharper than the overseer's whip, because it decided what officially existed and what did not. This role even allowed scribes to manipulate the system. Some used their literacy to rise into administration, advising nobles or priests. Others no doubt falsified records, skimming rations or favoring friends. Corruption is as old as bureaucracy. But because so few could read or write, scribes held a monopoly on truth itself. The daily life of a scribe was both privileged and crushingly monotonous. Morning began with roll calls, recording absences, noting illnesses, excusing funerals. Midday brought inventories of tools. How many chisels were issued? How many returned? How many broken? Afternoons were spent on grain tallies, tax receipts, temple offerings. Scroll after scroll, number after number. The papyri were stored in archives, rows of shelves, stacked with the dry rustle of thousands of records. Few survive today, but those that do read like the hum of a machine. 20 loaves issued to stonecutters. 2 jars of beer to the haulers. Absent came wasset due to sickness. Boring, yes, but this boredom kept the kingdom running. We imagine pharaohs as omnipotent, divine rulers whose will shape the land. But in truth, their power depended on the men with pens. Pharaohs could command pyramids, temples or armies, but without scribes to translate command into lists, schedules, and rations, nothing happened. In this sense, the scribes were the hidden architects of Egypt. The pharaoh might dream, but the scribes made dreams real through boring, relentless calculation. The pyramids endure as stone mountains in the desert, but the scribes who made them possible are mostly forgotten. Their papyrus records have crumbled, their names erased by time. And yet, their fingerprints are everywhere. In the concept of bureaucracy itself, in the very idea that civilization depends on paper as much as stone. At the height of Egypt's power, scribes were everywhere. They recorded not only the rations of pyramid builders, but also the taxes of farmers, the offerings of temples, and the decrees of kings. A pharaoh's command, shouted in a gilded hall, meant little until it was written down. Once inked onto papyrus, it became binding, enforceable, immortal. Even mundane acts passed through scribes. A farmer bringing barley to the granary, weighed, recorded, sealed. A priest distributing incense at a temple, tallied in red ink. A soldier rewarded for valor, his land granted inscribed, his name preserved. Every corner of Egyptian life passed through these men with pens. They did not build monuments with their hands. They built them with words. But ink fades faster than stone. The great pyramids still rise, but the ledgers of their construction are mostly lost. What survives are fragments, papyrus scraps from workers' villages, ostraca, pottery shards, covered in quick notes, inscriptions scratched into tomb walls. From these scraps, we glimpse their world. Complaints about missing rations, notes of absentees, tallies of bricks. They reveal not the pharaoh's grandeur, but the boredom of administration. Yet this boredom was as essential as limestone. The unseen engine of Egypt was paperwork, and without it, nothing worked. The irony is clear. The workers' sweat left monuments visible for millennia, while the scribes' neat writing turned to dust. The builders are forgotten. The record keepers are forgotten. Only the pyramids remain, mute witnesses to the bureaucracy that raised them. As Egypt changed, so too did the scribes. By the later dynasties, their monopoly on literacy weakened. Foreign conquerors, Persians, Greeks, Romans, introduced their own languages, their own administrators, their own scripts. Hieratic gave way to Demotic, then Greek, then Coptic. The world moved on, and the one sacred craft of the scribe became one of many professions. By the Roman era, literacy was no longer the rarest of gifts. Records were still kept, but scribes no longer commanded such unique authority. They became clerks, accountants, minor officials. Their exalted role faded, but their legacy did not vanish. It was absorbed. The idea of administration, of written accountability, of governments run on paper. This was Egypt's true gift. When you fill out a tax form today, you're echoing the work of a scribe in a mud brick office by the Nile. Historians sometimes argue that civilization is bureaucracy. It is not enough to build monuments, wage wars, or gather harvests. Without writing, without records, without endless lists, chaos wins. Egypt's scribes were among the first to prove this. The modern world still runs on their invention. Offices filled with clerks, accountants hunched over spreadsheets, warehouses humming with inventory lists. All of it is a descendant of Egyptian scribes. Their boredom became our foundation. Their monotony became our survival. When you stand before the pyramids, it is tempting to imagine only the laborers, sweating men dragging blocks, overseers shouting commands, kings gazing proudly. But behind them all were quiet figures on stools, dipping reeds into ink, scratching numbers into papyrus. They were invisible architects. They built not with stone, but with order. Their handwriting kept bread flowing, tools circulating and stones moving. Without them, the pyramids would never have risen. The scribes of Egypt remind us that history is not only made by warriors and kings. It is also made by the anonymous record keepers, the ones who counted, listed, and checked. Their work was tedious, but it was the very heartbeat of a civilization. And so the question lingers. When we admire the pyramids today, do we admire the brilliance of their builders or the invisible endurance of their clerks? Perhaps true immortality belongs not only to kings buried in stone, but to the idea that ink on paper can hold a world together. Rome was not built in a day, but it could be crossed in weeks because of its roads. From the heart of the city, stone highways stretched like veins across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. All roads lead to Rome was not just a saying. It was a logistical backbone of empire. Armies marched, merchants traveled, messengers carried news, all on roads laid stone by stone. But what we often forget is that building a road was only half the battle. Maintaining it was a never-ending task. Stones shifted, weeds crept up, drainage failed, and ruts from wagon wheels carved grooves deep into the pavement. And so the empire employed a forgotten class of workers, the inspectors who walked the roads, checking for cracks, ditches, and decay. Their job was neither glorious nor celebrated, but without them, the empire's proudest achievement would have crumbled in decades. At its height, Rome's road network spanned more than 400,000 kilometers, with about 80,000 kilometers paved in stone. To put that in perspective, that's enough to circle the earth 10 times. Keeping even a fraction of that intact required relentless inspection. Imagine a man walking mile after mile along the Via Appia, the queen of roads, scanning each slab of basalt for wear. He checks the ditches on either side, making sure water flows freely and does not pool, for stagnant water destroys stone. He measures the depth of ruts worn by iron-shod wheels. He notes where weeds threaten to crack joints. At the end of his journey, he reports to a superior, sometimes a local magistrate, sometimes a military officer, and lists the repairs needed. His notes are dull. At mile marker 42, the ditch is clogged. At mile marker 57, 3 stones need replacement. But this tedium preserved Rome's arteries of power. Road inspection was not one job, but many. Local magistrates, called curators viarum, oversaw stretches of highway. Wealthy senators were sometimes assigned roads as a civic duty, funding repairs out of their own purses. Not a popular assignment, but a prestigious one. Beneath them were contractors, laborers, and slaves who actually patched stones and dug ditches. The inspectors themselves were often minor officials or foremen, literate enough to keep records but humble enough to walk the roads themselves. They carried measuring rods, tools for marking, and tablets for notes. Their lives were repetitive, filled with long marches under the sun, conversations with villagers about road conditions, and endless complaints about wagons breaking stones. Unlike generals or engineers, their names were rarely inscribed. They were the invisible stewards of Roman order, remembered only in the durability of the roads they preserved. For the Romans, a straight road was more than engineering. It was a statement of authority. To carve a line through hills, forests, and swamps was to impose Roman order on nature itself. Inspectors upheld this philosophy. If a road curved or sagged, it was not just inconvenient. It was un-Roman. Thus, inspection was as much ideological as practical. To let a road crumble was to admit weakness. To keep it straight, drained, and firm was to proclaim Rome's permanence. Inspectors, in their dull rounds, were guardians of the empire's image. Road inspectors also lived on the fringes of Roman society. They ate in roadside inns, slept in way stations, and mingled with the endless stream of soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and slaves. They knew the gossip of villages, the prices of grain, the dangers of bandits. They saw more of the empire's daily life than most senators ever did. Their job was dull, yes, but it gave them a perspective no general could match. They walked the empire's veins step by step, mile by mile, ensuring that Rome's promise, speed, order, and connection did not collapse under the weight of neglect. But the roads were vast, the empire larger than any one man could oversee. And as centuries passed, cracks deepened, ditches clogged, and inspectors' notes pile higher. A Roman road was a marvel, layers of gravel, sand, and cut stone laid so precisely that some survive today. But no engineering triumph is immortal. Time, weather, and traffic gnawed at the roads. Inspectors did not just note problems. They triggered an entire machine of repair that stretched from village laborers to the Roman Senate itself. When an inspector spotted damage, the process began. He recorded the problem on a tablet. A crack in basalt, a collapsed culvert, a ditch choked with weeds. His report went to a local curator viarum, road overseer, who decided whether minor repairs could be handled locally or if larger funds were needed. Small issues, weeds, drainage ditches, loose gravel, were often fixed by local peasants or slaves requisitioned for the task. But bigger repairs, like replacing paving stones or rebuilding a bridge, require contractors. These were usually private citizens bidding for state contracts, promising to complete work within a set time for a set sum. It was a system both practical and corruptible. Some contractors did their jobs well. Others pocketed funds and left roads half-finished. Inspectors often had to double back, checking whether repairs had actually been carried out. Their notes could make or break reputations. Maintaining Rome's vast network was ruinously expensive. Some funds came from the state treasury, but much was pushed onto local communities. Town councils were expected to contribute labor and materials. Wealthy senators were sometimes honored, with the duty of paying for stretches of road. These so-called honors were resented. Records survive of senators grumbling about being saddled with miles of highway, forced to pour their own fortunes into projects they had little interest in, but refusing risk political disgrace. And so, stone by stone, roads became instruments of both pride and punishment. Inspectors found themselves caught in the middle. Their reports could force a senator to spend lavishly on repairs, or quietly protect him from expense. Their pens carried more political weight than one might expect from men trudging along dusty roads. For all this effort, neglect still crept in. A neglected Roman road did not collapse overnight. It decayed slowly, almost invisibly at first. A drainage ditch clogged with silt caused water to pool, softening the ground beneath. A single paving stone cracked, making wagons jolt and splinter. Drivers swerved, deepening ruts in the softer shoulders. Villagers avoided the worst sections, creating side paths that cut into the roadbed. Within years, a smooth highway could evolve into a rough track, no better than the dirt paths Rome had once replaced. Inspectors often wrote reports in tones of quiet frustration. At the 10th milestone, the road is impassable. At the 20th, wagons must detour. Such notes were bureaucratic death sentences for proud engineering works, unless funds were found to intervene. Roads were more than infrastructure. They were symbols. When emperors visited provinces, governors hurried to repair roads on their route, desperate to impress. A cracked stone might be ignored for years, until word came that the emperor's procession was coming. Then inspectors suddenly found their reports acted upon with urgency. This meant that upkeep was uneven. Some stretches gleamed with fresh stone, swept clean and straight, while others rotted quietly out of sight. Inspectors must have shaken their heads at the inconsistency. The empire's lifelines treated as stage decorations rather than the arteries of survival. The empire's greatest strength, its vastness, was also its weakness. The more territory Rome acquired, the more roads it built, and the more impossible maintenance became. Inspectors multiplied, but their tasks grew faster than their numbers. Their scrolls of notes piled higher, their complaints echoed louder, but resources stretched thin. A single empire could not indefinitely maintain 500,000 kilometers of roads without cracks showing. And in those cracks, history itself would one day slip. Because roads were not just stone, they were the veins of empire. And as the veins weakened, so did Rome's reach. Which leads to the question, when the roads began to fail, did Rome itself begin to crumble with them? Rome's roads were once called Viae Perpetui, eternal roads. And indeed, many of them survive to this day. But the truth is less triumphant. The system of inspection and repair, which had held the empire together, began to fray long before the stones themselves crumbled. As the empire staggered in the 3rd and 4th centuries, finances dried up, armies drained the treasury, corruption bloomed in the provinces. Inspectors were still appointed, but their reports increasingly went unanswered. A crack in a paving stone might once have triggered swift repair. Now it sat ignored, widening with each winter frost. The notes we have from this later period carry a tone of weary resignation. Roads difficult, bridges impassable, milestones toppled and left to weeds. The men who once took pride in reporting defects must have felt futility setting in. Their work became the dull art of cataloging decline. When Rome's Western Empire fell in the 5th century, the inspectors vanished with it. The bureaucracy collapsed. No more tablets filled with lists of broken stones. No more overseers sending funds for repair. And yet, the roads themselves remained scarred, worn, but still better than the dirt tracks of the tribes that succeeded Rome. Medieval kings, bishops, and merchants continued to walk them. Pilgrims trudged along them to shrines. Bandits haunted their shadows. Ironically, the absence of inspectors may have helped some roads endure. Without organized attempt at repair, often hasty and sloppy in the late Empire, the stones were left to settle into the earth, locked together by time. The great highways became narrower, rougher, but they remained. By the Middle Ages, Roman roads were already ancient, yet they still guided Europe's movements. Many of today's highways, across France, Spain, Britain, and Italy, trace their lines directly back to Roman surveyors. Medieval kings often revived Roman routes, repairing only what was absolutely necessary. Inspectors as a formal profession were gone, replaced by ad hoc duties of local lords or monastic orders. Travelers still noticed the difference. Chronicles describe stretches of old stone road, where journeys were smooth, contrasted with muddy detours where maintenance had lapsed for centuries. The ghost of the Roman inspector lingered, even if his name was forgotten. To walk a Roman road today is to walk the memory of inspection itself. Every groove from a wagon wheel, every stone settled unevenly, is a record of centuries of oversight and centuries of neglect. The inspector's true achievement was not that they kept every road perfect, they could not, but that they created the idea that infrastructure required vigilance. Roads were not monuments to be admired once. They were arteries to be maintained constantly. That philosophy, born in their dull reports, still governs the way nations think about highways, bridges, and rails. The roads teach us something uncomfortable. Empires are only as strong as their maintenance. Glory fades quickly if ditches clog and stones crack. The generals and emperors may win battles, but it is the anonymous inspectors, trudging mile by mile, who sustain an empire's reach. Their work was tedious, their lives obscure, their names erased. And yet, their boredom built endurance. Stand on a modern highway and listen to the roar of cars. Beneath the asphalt lies the ghost of Rome, and beneath Rome lies the memory of men who walk with tablets and rods, noting cracks, measuring ruts, nagging officials for funds. They were not heroes. They were not celebrated. But they were essential, and when their voices fell silent, so too did Rome's grip on the world. So perhaps the real question is this. Was Rome's fall written first in the loss of battles, or in the neglected reports of road inspectors no one bothered to read? Venice, the shimmering city of canals and palaces, was built on trade, glamour, and maritime daring. But beneath the romance, beneath the masked balls and glittering mosaics, Venice was obsessed with something utterly ordinary: grain. Without bread, even the richest republic starves. And so, behind the facades of marble and gold, a hidden army of clerks spent their lives in the most boring of duties, counting beans, tallying sacks, and keeping hunger at bay. Venice floated on water, not on fertile soil. Its lagoon could not produce enough food to sustain even a fraction of its population. Every loaf of bread depended on imports from the Po Valley, from Apulia, from Sicily, and eventually from as far as the Black Sea. This dependence made Venice both rich and vulnerable. Grain convoys had to arrive on time, ships had to be loaded carefully, and prices had to be kept stable. At the heart of this system stood the Officio del Bide, the grain office. Its officials did not wield swords or sails. They wielded ledgers. Their duty was to ensure that no Venetian went hungry, and that no baker cheated the system. Imagine stepping into the grain office. The room is dim, lined with shelves groaning under the weight of ledgers. At long tables, clerks dip quills into ink pots, recording shipment after shipment. Arrived today, 2 ships from Bari. Total cargo, 600 sacks of wheat. Inspected, weighed, sealed. Their handwriting is cramped, repetitive, but precise. Each sack of grain was weighed on great scales, inspected for quality, and then recorded in triplicate. 1 copy for the city, 1 for the office, 1 for the archives. The work was dull. Endless rows of numbers. Endless complaints from merchants about unfair weights. But the stakes were deadly serious. A mistake could mean shortages, riots, or famine. Grain was more than food. It was control. Venice subsidized bread to keep its citizens loyal. By controlling supply and price, the Republic ensured stability. A well-fed population was less likely to riot, less likely to question the oligarchs in the Doge's palace. Thus, the bean counters of the grain office were, in their own way, guardians of the state. A loaf of bread, sold at the right price, was a political tool. A shortage, whether real or rumored, could topple trust in the government overnight. Inspectors roamed the docks, watching as sacks were unloaded. They checked weights, sniffed for mold, tested for fraud. Merchants sometimes tried to slip in sand or stones to make sacks heavier. Others diluted wheat with barley. The inspectors' eyes had to be sharp, their suspicions constant. Behind them, clerks recorded everything. Who delivered, how much, from where, to whom. Venice's empire trade may have glittered with spices and silk, but survival depended on wheat, and wheat depended on paperwork. For the men of the grain office, life was monotony. Day after day, they copied numbers, settled disputes, and filed records into the archives. Their names rarely appear in the annals of Venice. They were not explorers like Marco Polo, nor admirals like Andrea Doria. They were shadows in ink, forgotten as individuals but remembered in their system. And yet, their boredom was a republic's safety net. While gondolas glided through the canals, while merchants bargained in the markets, while the Doge resided in his crimson robes, these clerks sat hunched in candlelight, quietly preventing catastrophe. But grain was never a simple matter. Storms delayed convoys. Pirates seized ships. Corruption crept into the offices. And the price of bread, the heartbeat of Venice, could rise or fall with terrifying speed. Which leaves us to ask, what happened when the ledgers failed, when shortages hit, and the city of canals faced the threat of hunger? For all its precision, the Venetian grain system was fragile. The city's wealth depended on foreign wheat, and foreign wheat depended on weather, harvests, and war. A storm in the Adriatic, a bad harvest in Sicily, or a pirate raid in the Ionian Sea could turn ledgers into death sentences. Venetians feared nothing more than empty bakeries. Bread was the foundation of diet, the daily comfort of rich and poor alike. When grain convoys were delayed, tension rippled through the canals. Markets buzzed with rumors. The ships are lost. The sacks are spoiled. Prices will rise. The grain office scrambled to calm fears. Clerks reassured bakers. Inspectors promised supplies. And officials sometimes dipped into emergency reserves stored in government granaries. But reserves were finite. When ships did not arrive, the city teetered on the edge of hunger. Even the most efficient office could not prevent anger when loaves grew scarce. More than once in Venetian history, bread riots broke out. Crowds stormed bakeries, demanding loaves at the subsidized price. Merchants accused the grain office of favoritism. Bakers pleaded that they could not afford to sell below cost. And always, behind the chaos, clerks tried to impose order with ink. They inspected scales in bakeries, fined bakers who hoarded, and posted official price notices on city walls. Their ledgers became shields against mob anger, though flimsy ones at best. Where there is scarcity, there is corruption. Some officials skimmed grain before it reached the scales. Others colluded with merchants, allowing underweight sacks to pass inspection. Bakers bribed inspectors to overlook diluted flour. The grain office, meant to ensure fairness, sometimes became a theater of fraud. Whispers of corruption eroded trust. Citizens who suspected theft looked not to the sea for pirates, but to their own officials. Yet, for every corrupt inspector, there were dozens who followed the rules, trudging through monotonous checks, terrified that a missed fraud would mean public disgrace. The bureaucracy survived because, more often than not, boredom triumphed over greed. Bread was not just food, it was loyalty. The Venetian Republic understood this. By subsidizing loaves, the state kept citizens fed and docile. But in times of crisis, the system became a political weapon. Opponents accused rivals of mishandling supplies. Grain offices were purged, ledgers re-audited, inspectors replaced. Sometimes, shortages were blamed on foreign enemies, Genoa, the Turks, or distant storms. Other times, fingers pointed inward at corrupt officials or negligent clerks. The truth mattered less than the perception. As long as bread was on the table, the republic seemed eternal. When bread faltered, cracks appeared in its foundations. Imagine being a clerk during such a crisis. You sit at your desk, quill in hand, while outside crowds shout. A baker pounds on your door, begging for more flour. A merchant demands his shipment be recorded as larger than it is. The Doge's council pressures you to show reassuring numbers. Your scroll fills with entries you know are half-truths. You are not a politician, not a soldier, but suddenly the fate of Venice rests on your neat columns of numbers. It was a heavy burden, born in silence, under candlelight, through boredom and ink stains. The grain office could manage crises for a time, but shortages always returned. Pirates, storms, corruption, all chipped at the delicate balance. Venice was a marvel of marble and mosaics, but it was always perched on the edge of hunger. Unlike inland cities with fertile hinterlands, the lagoon had no wheat fields, no barns fat with harvest. Every loaf of bread was imported, tracked, and tallied. The grain office was not a minor bureaucracy. It was the heartbeat of survival. For centuries, Venice chased security through expansion. It established grain depots on Crete, the Dalmatian coast, and Cyprus. Convoys sailed from Apulia and Sicily under heavy guard. The Republic even signed treaties with Muslim powers to guarantee wheat shipments from the Black Sea. And always, the ledgers followed. Inspectors recorded contracts. Clerks tallied arrivals, and accountants balanced subsidies. Grain was not glamorous like spices or silk, but it was the one commodity Venice could never afford to lose. In good years, the system worked seamlessly. Ships arrived, granaries filled, bread prices stayed stable. In bad years, the city walked a knife's edge. A few missed convoys could tip Venice from wealth into unrest. As the centuries passed, Venice's dominance waned. Ottoman expansion cut off grain sources in the eastern Mediterranean. Competition from Atlantic powers shifted trade routes away from the Adriatic. Famine struck more often, and Venice struggled to keep up. The grain office persisted, but its authority weakened. Records from the 16th and 17th centuries show mounting complaints. Shortages, fraud, spiraling prices. Citizens grumbled that the once mighty republic could not even guarantee a loaf of bread. By the 18th century, as Venice slid into stagnation, the grain office became more ceremonial than functional. Its clerks still counted sacks, but their ledgers no longer controlled the city's destiny. The republic itself was starving, not for bread, but for relevance. And yet, the legacy of Venice's bean counters lived on. The idea that a state must manage food supply with bureaucratic rigor became a model across Europe. France's royal grain offices, England's naval victualling boards, even modern ministries of agriculture owe something to Venetian precedent. Their lesson was simple. Survival requires boring work. It requires men hunched over tables, writing columns of numbers, double-checking sacks, resisting corruption, and enduring monotony. No empire, however grand, survives on glory alone. It survives on grain. The clerks of the grain office left no monuments. Their names are mostly lost, their lives uncelebrated. They were shadows in candlelight, scratching numbers while gondolas drifted outside. Yet their boredom prevented riots, sustained armies, and kept the city alive for centuries. If the Doge was the face of Venice, they were its stomach, invisible but essential. When you picture Venice, you see canals, gondolas, and glittering palaces. But beneath the beauty was paperwork, and beneath the paperwork was survival. The Republic floated not only on water, but on ledgers. In Russia, distance was destiny. The empire stretched across endless forests, rivers, and plains, bound together less by borders than by the fragile thread of communication. To carry a message from Moscow to Siberia was not simply a matter of horses and roads. It was a battle against winter itself. And in that battle, there were no soldiers more stubborn, more forgotten than the imperial couriers. Before the telegraph, before the railroad, a letter was a fragile lifeline. Orders from the Tsar, tax reports, military commands, and private petitions all depended on the speed of men who rode or trudged through blizzards. A delay could mean disaster. An army might starve waiting for supplies. A governor might misstep without instructions. A merchant might lose fortunes if contracts arrived too late. And so the Russian state built a postal system of relay stations, yam posts, spaced along the great roads. At each station, a courier could change horses, warm himself briefly, and set off again. In theory, the system was efficient. In practice, it was punishing. The Russian winter was not just cold. It was lethal. Temperatures plunged below -30. Winds cut like knives. Roads disappeared beneath snowdrifts. Rivers froze solid, and forests groaned under ice. Couriers wrapped themselves in furs, faces covered until only their eyes peeked out. Yet frost still gnawed through seams and seemed split under strain. Travel was relentless. Couriers rode day and night, sleeping little, eating less. To stop too long meant death by freezing. Horses collapsed, breath steaming in the dark. Wolves prowled the forest, drawn to the smell of sweat and horses. The courier pressed on, because he carried the Tsar's words, and lateness was punished with lashes, or worse. For an ordinary peasant, a late arrival might mean little. For a courier, it was a matter of survival, not just against the cold, but against the superiors. Reports tell of men flogged for failing to deliver letters on time, of couriers stripped of pay, of entire relay posts punished for sloth, if delays accumulated. The empire had little patience for excuses. And yet, delays were inevitable. How could one outrun a blizzard? How could one make horses gallop through chest-deep snow? The inspectors who monitored the routes often knew this. But rules were rules. A late courier, even one frostbitten and near death, risked punishment upon arrival. It was a cruel system, but it forced endurance. Better to lose a finger to frostbite than to arrive with excuses. The yam posts were lifelines, but bleak ones. A typical station was a log house with a stable, a fire, and little else. The keeper might offer soup, bread, or vodka, but the respite was brief. Horses were swapped quickly, and the courier pushed back into storm. Travelers often described the post as filthy and crowded, full of smoke and fleas, with exhausted men huddled by the fire. Yet for couriers, they were salvation. A few hours' warmth could mean the difference between life and death. Then came the knock on the door, the cry of "next horse," and the road called again. The courier's life was isolation. He was neither soldier nor noble, neither farmer nor free traveler. He belonged to the road. Few remembered his name. Fewer honored his labor. He was a shadow between stations, his presence noticed only when messages arrived late. And yet, his work bound Russia together. Without him, the empire would have been a patchwork of disconnected provinces. With him, orders flowed, news traveled, and distant governors still felt the Tsar's hand. But even the most disciplined courier could not outrun the slow tyranny of distance. Russia was too vast, winters too long, punishments too harsh. The strength of Russia's imperial post was not in speed, nor even in reliability. It was in endurance. No single courier could carry a letter across 1,000 kilometers, but the YAM network, like a great chain, linked one exhausted rider to another, one weary horse to the next. The YAM, or relay post, was the backbone of communication. Established as early as the Mongol period and perfected by the Tsars, these stations were scattered every 25 to 40 kilometers along the great highways. Each post kept horses, sleds, food, and a small staff of attendants. A courier would arrive, frost clinging to his beard, horse staggering with exhaustion. He would hand over his dispatches, eat a quick bowl of soup or a chunk of black bread, then mount a fresh horse and continue. The old horse rested. The message moved. The rhythm was relentless. For the system to work, every post had a function. If one keeper was lazy, if one stable lacked horses, the chain broke. Inspectors patrolled to ensure order, and punishments were severe for dereliction. The empire depended on this invisible machine. But endurance had a price. The YAM posts drained local populations, who were often required to supply horses, fodder, and labor. For peasants already crushed by taxes, this burden was resented bitterly. Complaints poured in of families left without draft animals because the postal service had requisitioned them. In famine years, resentment turned into quiet sabotage. Horses starved, posts went unmanned, and couriers cursed delays. Funding the YAM was a constant struggle. The Tsar's court demanded speed, but rarely provided enough silver. Local governors covered the gap by squeezing villages, which in turn bred hatred. To many peasants, the imperial courier was not a hero but a parasite, consuming their horses and grain while delivering the Tsar's commands they would never see. Despite the system's rigor, failures were constant. Horses froze mid-journey, collapsing in the snow. Bridges gave way under sleds. Rivers swallowed riders whole when ice cracked beneath them. Wolves, drawn by the smell of animals, sometimes attacked sleds in packs, forcing couriers to fire pistols into the dark or lash their horses into frantic gallops. Letters were lost, destroyed, or stolen. Entire bags might vanish in storms, scattered into drifts. And yet, the system endured, because enough letters did arrive, enough orders did reach governors, enough news did spread to keep the empire stitched together. The resilience of the couriers themselves was the system's greatest strength. They were not celebrated, but they endured. They developed tricks, stuffing sleds with straw for warmth, wrapping feet in rags, eating frozen bread softened with vodka. They learned to sleep in short bursts at posts, waking at the crack of a whip. They were paid little, punished harshly, and remembered rarely. But they pressed on, mile after mile, year after year. Their boredom and suffering became the empire's lifeline. Think of the Yam as the empire's arteries. Moscow was the heart, pumping orders outward. The posts were the veins, carrying lifeblood into distant provinces. If the arteries clogged, the bodies sickened. Without the couriers trudging through snow, the Tsar's rule would have dissolved into silence. The system was not glamorous. It was not swift, but it was enough. Russia survived not on brilliance, but on endurance. And the couriers embodied that endurance. But endurance had limits. As Russia expanded further east, distances grew unbearable, and even the Yam system strained. Messages took weeks, then months, to arrive. The couriers could not outrun geography. For centuries, Russia's lifeline was carried not by machines, but by men hunched in sleds, wrapped in furs, pushing horses across frozen plains. They stitched the empire together 1 mile at a time. But like all human endurance, theirs had limits. By the 19th century, the age of frozen couriers began to fade, replaced by steel, wire, and the hum of modernity. Russia's curse was always distance. Even the best courier system could not make up for geography. A letter from St. Petersburg to Irkutsk could take 6 weeks in winter, longer as storms or uprisings blocked the roads. Officials at the edge of the empire governed in near isolation, relying on months-old orders by the time they arrived. Couriers pushed themselves to collapse, but time was against them. A world moving toward instant communication could not tolerate the lag. The Tsars demanded something faster, something immune to blizzards and wolves. The telegraph shattered the tyranny of distance. Beginning in the mid-19th century, wires spread across Russia, first along major routes, then deep into provinces. Messages that once took weeks arrived in hours. Governors who had grown used to long autonomy found themselves suddenly micromanaged by St. Petersburg. For the frozen couriers, this was both a relief and a death sentence. Their work became less vital. The Tsar's orders no longer needed to ride in saddlebags. They traveled invisibly along copper strands. The blizzard no longer delayed commands. Yet the telegraph did not entirely replace couriers. Letters, packages, and local orders still required men on the road. But their prestige, such as it was, evaporated. They became secondary, their once deadly duty downgraded to errands. Then came the railways. Trains cut through forests and steppes, carrying sacks of mail at speeds no horse could match. By the late 19th century, postal cars rattled across Siberia, slashing delivery times. The Yam stations, once the empire's lifeblood, fell into disuse. Some became taverns, others decayed into ruins, their stables empty, their fires gone cold. For the men who had once risked frostbite and wolves, the change was bittersweet. No longer did they fear lashes for delays, no longer did they ride until their fingers froze. But neither were they essential. They were relics, ghosts of harsher time. Though the couriers vanished, their endurance left a mark on Russian identity. Folk tales remembered the rider in the blizzard, galloping through darkness with the Tsar's seal in his pouch. Literature, too, caught fragments of their lives. Gogol's troikas, Dostoevsky's snowy roads, Tolstoy's weary travelers. Even today, Russian culture reveres the idea of endurance against winter, of stubborn survival against nature's cruelty. That spirit was embodied first by peasants, then by soldiers, but also, quietly, by couriers who refused to stop riding. The frozen postman taught an empire a simple lesson. Distance can only be endured, never conquered. They proved that survival is sometimes a matter of repetition. One horse, one station, 1 mile after another. Their work was monotonous, their lives obscure, but their persistence kept the empire alive until technology could take over. In their boredom lay resilience. In their suffering lay continuity. Stand on a Russian winter road today. The snow still drifts, the wind still cuts, the horizon still stretches endlessly. But no courier rides past with frost clinging to his beard. The telegraph silenced him. The railway replaced him. And yet, his ghost lingers in the Russian imagination. The figure who pressed on when everything in the world screamed to stop. He was punished if late, forgotten if successful, invisible in history books. But without him, the empire would have dissolved into silence. So perhaps the true strength of Russia was never the Tsar's crown nor the army's might, but the weary man in furs, hunched in a sleigh, muttering through frozen lips as he carried the empire's heartbeat through the snow. In the Middle Ages, darkness ruled most of life. The sun set, and the world became a place of shadows, flickering fires and long nights. To work after dusk, to read, to pray, even to stumble safely through a home, all required light. And light meant candles. Candles were not luxuries. They were necessities. Churches demanded them for services, households for evening chores, travelers for the road, merchants for their stalls. Yet behind each wick was a world of rules, disputes, and paperwork, policed by guilds that controlled the very substance of night. By the 12th century, many European cities saw the rise of candlemakers' guilds. These were associations of craftsmen, sworn to protect their trade, regulate quality, and, most importantly, control the market. They dictated who could make candles, where they could be sold, what prices could be charged, and even how long a wick should burn. To join, an apprentice endured years of tedious training. He learned how to render fat into tallow, how to boil, strain, and pour. He learned the difference between common tallow candles, smoky and foul-smelling, and the rare, expensive beeswax candles, golden and clean. Only when the guild approved could he rise to journeyman, and eventually, if fortune favored him, to master candlemaker. But the guild's main activity was not craft. It was argument. Meetings dragged on for hours over disputes about prices, rights, and privileges. Members squabbled about territory, who could sell in which district, who had the right to light churches, who could supply the city council. The flame itself may have been steady, but the men who made it rarely were. For ordinary people, candles were as much ration as food. A household might buy a few tallow candles a week, using them sparingly. Families often lived in near darkness, lighting a single flame for supper before letting night claim the house. Churches, on the other hand, consumed candles in vast numbers. Altars required them. Rituals demanded them. Processions burned them by the dozens. Monasteries ordered them in bulk, filling their accounts with guild-approved suppliers. And so, the guilds fought bitterly over these contracts. To secure a cathedral's candle order was to win a fortune. To lose, it was to risk ruin. The disputes also hinged on material. Tallow, made from animal fat, was cheap but smoky, filling rooms with an acrid stench. Wax, harvested from bees, burned cleanly and beautifully, but was so expensive it was reserved for the wealthy and for holy use. Guilds split along these lines. Tallow chandlers and wax chandlers accused each other of unfair practices. Tallow makers complained that wax sellers monopolized church contracts. Wax makers accused tallow sellers of cutting corners with adulterated fat. The argument spilled into courts, councils, and markets. Candles, those humble sticks of light, became symbols of class, privilege, and endless contention. To keep order, guild inspectors patrolled workshops and markets. They measured candles, sniffed them for impurities, and checked wicks. Fraud was punished harshly. A candlemaker caught selling underweight or adulterated goods could be fined, whipped, or expelled from the guild. Imagine the monotony of this work. Weighing candles one by one, checking if wicks were centered, sniffing for traces of rancid fat. It was thankless, boring, and yet essential. Without regulation, customers would cheat or be cheated, and chaos would descend into the already fragile economy of light. Beneath the disputes lay a deeper truth. Whoever controlled candles controlled the night. Candles lit council chambers where decisions were made, churches where prayers were said, and taverns where deals were struck. Without light, society slept. With it, life continued. Thus, the Candlemakers Guild was not just a trade association. It was a gatekeeper of civilization's rhythm. Their arguments over wax and tallow were, in their own way, arguments about power itself. But as demand for candles grew, so did the disputes. Guilds quarreled more fiercely, monopolies tightened, and resentment spread among those excluded. Candles were meant to bring calm and clarity, but in medieval towns, they often fueled conflict. Their production, sale, and use touched nearly every corner of society, and wherever something was both necessary and scarce. Disputes were inevitable. Guild privileges were jealously guarded. In London, Paris, Venice, and countless smaller towns, chandlers fought over who had the right to sell ware. Was it fair for a tallow maker to peddle cheap candles in a district reserved for wax merchants? Could monks make their own candles, bypassing guild prices? Could itinerant peddlers hawk candles on the street without paying dues? Court records show endless complaints. Wax chandlers suing tallow chandlers for poaching customers. Guild inspectors seizing unauthorized candles. Fines levied for selling after dark without a permit. Yes, even the right to sell light at night could be restricted. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. But to the candle makers, each wick was a piece of territory, and every territory had to be defended. The disputes were not just economic, they were social. Tallow candles, smoky and cheap, lit the hovels of peasants and workshops of laborers. Wax candles, clean and golden, glowed in palaces, cathedrals, and council halls. Thus, candles became symbols of class. To light a wax candle at home was to flaunt wealth. To rely only on tallow was to display poverty. The guilds reinforced this divide, guarding wax as a product of prestige, and ensuring that the poor remained in smoke-filled rooms. Resentment festered. Records tell of riots where townsfolk accused chandlers of hoarding wax, driving up prices. Bakers and brewers, who relied on candlelight for their work before dawn, joined the complaints. The price of bread and beer could rise because of disputes over light. Fraud was common, and guild inspectors were relentless in seeking it out. Some chandlers mixed cheaper fats into wax, producing candles that sputtered and smoked while masquerading as luxury. Others sold underweight sticks or cut wicks too short, so the candle would burn out quickly. Punishments were public and humiliating. Fraudulent chandlers were fined, their goods burned, sometimes their shops closed. Chronic offenders could be whipped or expelled from the guild entirely, a sentence that meant ruin. And yet, fraud never disappeared. The temptation was too strong, the profits too tempting, and inspectors too few to watch every stall. The disputes reached even higher levels. City councils often had to step in, regulating candle prices, rationing supplies in times of shortage, and arbitrating between rival guilds. In some cities, the council itself held monopoly rights, leasing them to chosen chandlers. In times of war or famine, candles could even be requisitioned by the state. Armies needed them for night marches, navies for lanterns, churches for endless vigils. Ordinary citizens were told to go without so that armies or priests could burn light in abundance. Each decree sparked bitterness, but obedience was enforced. In a world without electricity, darkness was not a nuisance. It was a danger. To be without light was to stumble into thieves, to halt work, to lose precious hours. And so, when candle became too costly or scarce, unrest always followed. One 14th century chronicle describes a riot in Paris when candle prices doubled after a harsh winter. Angry crowds stormed chandlers' shops, accusing them of hoarding. The guild begged the council for protection, insisting that shortages were beyond their control. In truth, both sides were trapped. The chandlers needed profit, the people needed light, and there was never quite enough wax to satisfy both. But candles, for all the disputes, were never eternal. Change was coming. Oil lamps spread, new fuels emerged, and eventually gaslight flickered in the streets. For centuries, the candlemakers' guilds fought, argued, and found their way through disputes over wax, tallow, and territory. They controlled the night with rules and inspections, rationing light as if it were gold. But no monopoly lasts forever. The age of candles as rulers of darkness began to fade in the early modern era, and with it, the guild's power. By the 17th and 18th centuries, new sources of light began creeping into daily life. Oil lamps grew more efficient. Whale oil, though foul-smelling, provided a brighter flame than tallow. In some cities, especially coastal ones, oil lamps began to replace candles in wealthier homes. The real blow came in the late 18th and early 19th centuries with the rise of gaslight. Entire streets would be illuminated with a steady glow, transforming nightlife, commerce, and safety. For the first time, darkness was no longer absolute. Candles did not vanish overnight. They remained essential in homes, churches, and rural villages. But their monopoly as the master of night was broken. A chandler could no longer dictate prices to a city where gas lamps burned in the streets. The candlemakers' guilds fought back, of course. They petitioned councils to restrict oil lamps, arguing they were dangerous. They lobbied against gas companies, spreading rumors of explosions. They insisted that nothing was purer than beeswax, nothing safer than tallow. But their arguments grew weaker each year. Consumers were not sentimental. They wanted light, and they wanted it cheap. Oil, gas, and eventually kerosene lamps delivered both. By the mid-19th century, many candle guilds had been dissolved or reduced to minor trade associations. Their endless disputes, once recorded in thick registers of fines and rules, dwindled into silence. Freed from guild monopolies, candles became just another commodity. Factories mass-produced them, pouring tallow and steering into molds by the thousands. What had once been a carefully regulated craft was reduced to industry. The result was abundance. For the first time in history, even the poor could afford candles in greater numbers. Light became less a privilege and more a common utility. Ironically, the collapse of the guilds gave ordinary people more freedom to chase away the night. And yet, their legacy lingers. The guilds established the principle that quality mattered, that fraud must be punished, that light was too important to leave unregulated. Their arguments about wick length and wax purity echo in today's safety standards, consumer protections, and trade regulations. More strangely, the symbolism of candles endured long after their economic dominance. We still light them for rituals, birthdays, and vigils. A single flame still carries more meaning than a street of electric bulbs. The guilds may have faded, but their product retained its quiet poetry. Walk through an old European city today, past grand cathedrals and medieval guild halls. Somewhere inside, you'll still find candles burning, on altars and shrines, in quiet corners of memory. They are no longer monopolized, no longer fought over, no longer the center of riots. But they remain. The candle makers who once squabbled endlessly would not recognize this new world of cheap electricity and neon lights. Yet their boredom, their disputes, their relentless regulation of flame kept darkness at bay for centuries. Candles were not just light. They were power, class, and conflict. Their guilds argued endlessly over details that now seem absurd. Wick length, wax purity, district monopolies. But in those arguments lay the survival of cities. In the medieval world, power was not only castles, armies, and crowns. Power was land. Who owned which field, which meadow, which strip of forest? These questions shaped lives more than royal decrees or battles. And so, behind the knights and kings, there worked a quieter profession, the surveyors. They were not warriors, not priests, not nobles. They were men with ropes, stakes, and tablets, trudging through mud and rain to measure out the world, one field at a time. Their work was slow, boring, and disputed endlessly, but without them, feudal society could not have functioned. Feudalism was built on land. Lords granted estates to vassals, who owed service in return. Peasants farmed strips in open fields, owing rents or labor. Monasteries held vast tracts, supported by tithes. And always, the question arose, where did one plot end and another begin? Without clear boundaries, disputes multiplied. A peasant might cut hay in a meadow claimed by two lords. A monastery might collect tithes from land that technically belonged to a knight. Forests were the worst of all, rich in timber, game, and pasture, and constant sources of quarrel. Surveyors were called in to settle these disputes. Their task was not glorious. They walked the land, stretched ropes across fields, planted stakes, and scribbled notes. Their judgments were argued over manorial courts, appealed, sometimes ignored. But without them, chaos spread. Their instruments were simple. A rope, often knotted at intervals, served as the primary tool. Some used rods of standard length, often the perch or chain. Stakes marked boundaries. Compasses and crude sighting devices appeared later, but for much of the Middle Ages, surveying was a matter of counting steps and stretching cords. Errors were inevitable. Ropes stretched when wet. Knots slipped. Men argued over whether a boundary ditch ran straight or curved. A surveyor's word carried weight, but it was never beyond challenge. And yet, these crude tools built the maps of Europe, one muddy field at a time. Every measurement produced disputes. Peasants swore that their strips had shrunk. Lords accused each other of encroachment. Monasteries cited ancient charters, while neighbors insisted that markers had shifted. Surveyors found themselves not only measuring land, but refereeing quarrels. Their reports were dragged into manorial courts, read aloud, debated, and sometimes overturned. A single misplaced stake could spark decades of litigation. One chronicler recorded a boundary dispute between two abbeys that dragged on for generations, each producing surveyors' notes to prove their case. The abbots prayed for peace, but the surveyors' measurements ensured that arguments never truly ended. The surveyor's life was hard and thankless. He trudged through fields in all weather, carrying ropes, rods, and tablets. He faced the hostility of peasants suspicious of losing land, and the impatience of lords eager for favorable results. He was paid modestly, often in food, drink, or coin, but rarely honored. His name was not inscribed in chronicles, his work not praised in song. Yet every harvest, every tithe, every rent owed depended on his dull calculations. Surveyors embodied the medieval paradox, invisible men whose boredom sustained a visible order. But measuring land was not only practical, it was also political. Every line drawn on the ground reflected power. Who ruled, who paid, who ate. In theory, a surveyor was impartial. His rope measured the same length for peasant or noble. His stakes marked boundaries without bias. But in practice, every measurement was political. In the medieval world, land was wealth, land was power, and land was survival. Whoever controlled it controlled everything. Surveyors were often hired by lords or monasteries, and their livelihoods depended on pleasing patrons. It was all too easy to stretch a measurement slightly in a master's favor, to plant a stake a few feet further into a neighbor's meadow, to interpret a charter generously. Peasants knew this, and they grumbled. "The rope is longer for the Lord than for us," they said. And often they were right. Surveyors who wanted steady work tilted their findings subtly toward the powerful. This did not always go unnoticed. Neighboring lords accused each other of fraud. Villagers protested that their grazing lands had been stolen. Manorial courts became stages for disputes rooted not in battles of swords, but in battles of measurements. Medieval land law was a tangle of ancient charters, oral traditions, and practical boundaries. A monastery might produce a parchment declaring it owned a forest from the old oak to the river. But which oak? Which bend of the river? Surveyors were dragged into these debates as arbiters. They walked the ground, stretched ropes, and interpreted words written centuries before. Inevitably, their conclusion satisfied one side and enraged the other. Sometimes their work confirmed old boundaries. Other times it effectively rewrote them. And so, with a rope and a few stakes, surveyors could shift the balance of power in entire villages. Surveyors also found themselves caught between rival powers. A local lord might order one survey, while a monastery commissioned another. Two sets of measurements, each official, could be presented in court, contradicting one another. Judges, often lords themselves, chose whichever suited their interests. This made surveyors both useful and vulnerable. They could be bribed, threatened, or punished. A favorable measurement might win them patronage. An unfavorable one might end their career, or worse. There are records of surveyors attacked by angry peasants, accused of stealing land with their ropes. Surveying was not confined to dusty offices. Disputes were often settled on the land itself, with lords, peasants, monks, and surveyors all present. The rope was stretched, the stakes driven, the charter read aloud. Witnesses shouted. Tempers flared. Sometimes violence broke out. A 13th century English record describes such a dispute. Two villages met in a field to settle a boundary. The surveyor stretched his rope, but both sides claimed the stakes were wrong. Shouting turned to blows, and the case ended not in clarity, but in bloodshed. For surveyors, such scenes were routine. Their profession was one of endless argument, where no measurement was ever final. And yet, through all the disputes, surveyors' dull routines held society together. Without boundaries, taxes could not be collected. Without taxes, lords could not rule. Without measured strips, peasants could not know which land to farm. Surveyors might have been pawns, often mistrusted, but their work was essential. Their ropes and stakes were the hidden architecture of feudal life. But as centuries passed, surveying grew more complex. New tools, new maps, and new laws emerged. The work remained boring, but its influence grew, from village disputes to royal decrees. Surveyors rarely saw themselves as shapers of history. To them, the job was trudging through mud, stretching ropes, and hammering stakes while peasants muttered and lords argued. Yet their boring craft outlived castles and crowns. Over centuries, their quiet measurements accumulated into something larger, the very framework of modern nations. In the early Middle Ages, most surveys were oral or symbolic. A tree here, a ditch there, a stone set upright. But as the centuries wore on, written records and rudimentary maps began to appear. Monasteries especially began keeping parchment plans of their estates, showing fields, streams, and boundary markers. Surveyors supplied the raw data for these documents. Their ropes and notes were translated into lines on parchment. Crude, yes, but revolutionary. For the first time, land could be seen not only in fields and fences, but on a page. Over time, these records grew more sophisticated. In England, Doomsday Book 1086 was less a survey of ropes and stakes than a survey of taxes, but depended on the same principle. Land must be measured, listed, and defined. Surveyors' dull work had become the foundation of kings' knowledge. By the late medieval and early modern period, surveying began to evolve into a profession with specialized tools. Compasses, quadrants, and eventually theodolites replaced ropes alone. Mathematics crept into the craft. Yet the principle remained the same: disputes over fields, forests, and rivers. Only the precision improved. What had once been approximate became exact, and with exactness came more authority. When a surveyor's map was inked with geometry and angles, it was harder for a peasant or lord to argue it away. Thus, the boring village surveyor, once a pawn, became a proto-scientist, one whose craft shaped the rise of law, taxation, and property rights. It is no exaggeration to say that modern states grew out of medieval surveys. Boundaries drawn by stakes hardened into charters. Charters hardened into maps. Maps hardened into borders. The tax systems of kingdoms depended on knowing exactly who farmed which field and how much they owed. Armies marched on supplies gathered from land whose boundaries had been defined by surveyors. Even the church's tithes required precise divisions: a tenth of which harvest, from which plot, owed to which parish. Without the quiet work of measuring dirt, the loud work of kings and armies would have collapsed. And yet, the surveyors themselves were forgotten. Their names were rarely recorded. Their ropes rotted, their stakes vanished, their notes crumbled. Kings, lords, and abbots appear in chronicles, but not the men who walked the fields to measure their wealth. We walk today on a skeleton they built, but their faces are lost. Their boredom endured longer than the glory of knights. Look at a modern map. Borders snake across continents, dividing nations with precise lines. Behind each line is 1,000 years of measurement, of men with ropes and rods, trudging across fields, deciding which ditch belonged to whom. Every land registry, every deed, every property line owes something to forgotten surveyors of the medieval world. Their dull work became civilization's skeleton. Surveyors did not fight wars or build cathedrals. They did something more tedious and more lasting. They measured, listed, and recorded. Their ropes stretched across fields became invisible lines that still divide nations. In the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, silk was not merely cloth. It was money, diplomacy, tribute, and power. Bolts of silk moved across Asia's currency. offered to allies, demanded from vassals, and gifted to foreign rulers. A strip of fabric could be worth more than a sack of coins, its shimmer carrying the prestige of the empire itself. But silk was fragile, too wide, too narrow, too heavy, too light, too knotted, and it could lose value instantly. And so, the empire employed a cadre of bureaucrats whose job was neither glamorous nor creative. The weaving inspectors. They did not design nor weave, nor wear. They measured, weighed, and judged. The Tang court established state-run weaving workshops in the capital cities of Chang'an and Luoyang. These workshops employed thousands of women, often conscripted from across the empire. Day after day, they sat at looms, throwing shuttles back and forth, weaving silk destined for palaces, temples, or tribute caravans. Over them stood inspectors, stern officials with ledgers, rods, and scales. Their task was to enforce standards. A bolt of silk must be a precise width. Its threads must be even, its weight exact. Knots, snags, or weak strands were unacceptable. The inspectors walked the workshops, examining cloth as it came off the loom. They ran fingers across the weave, searching for flaws invisible to the untrained eye. They unrolled bolts and weighed them. They scribbled notes in ledgers, recording lengths, widths, and grades. Their presence was dreaded. For the weavers, a single mistake could mean punishment. For the inspectors, a single missed flaw could mean disgrace. Why such precision? Because silk was more than fabric. It was currency. Tax obligations could be paid in bolts of silk. Soldiers received silk as part of their wages. Foreign diplomats were bribed or rewarded with silk. And like currency, it had to be trusted. A merchant who received underweight silk might refuse it. A soldier who found his pay bolt flawed might complain. A vassal king who received poor quality silk as tribute might see insult instead of honor. Thus, inspectors were guardians of trust. Their boring tallies ensured that the empire's currency did not devalue. For the women at the looms, the inspectors were both overseers and threats. Weaving was grueling work, hours of repetitive motion, sitting hunched, eyes straining in dim light. Fingers bled, backs ached, and mistakes were inevitable. When inspectors found errors, punishments followed. Sometimes wages were docked. Sometimes women were beaten. In severe cases, especially when silk was destined for the court, whole batches of cloth could be confiscated, and weavers dismissed in disgrace. And yet, despite the harshness, the system functioned. The empire demanded silk in vast quantities, and inspectors ensured it flowed smoothly, bolt after bolt, unblemished and uniform. For the inspectors themselves, life was monotony. They did not create beauty. They looked for flaws. They sat with ledgers, calculating lengths, recording weights, marking grades. Their authority was immense, but their work was joyless. Day after day, they unrolled silk, squinted at threads, dipped pens in ink. Some no doubt grew corrupt, taking bribes to overlook flaws. Others were strict to the point of cruelty, but most simply endured, their boredom sustaining the empire's prestige. But silk was not only cloth or currency, it was politics. As demand for it grew, inspectors found themselves entangled in rivalries, corruption scandals, and international trade disputes. The Tang bureaucracy prided itself on order, but silk had a way of tangling even the straightest ledgers. The inspectors, meant to ensure fairness, found themselves balancing impossible demands. Perfection from the weavers, trust from the state, and temptation from the merchants who lived off silk's shimmer. Inspectors were feared because their judgments could ruin a weaver or save her. One harsh mark on a ledger could mean lost wages, confiscated cloth, or even corporal punishment. This power made inspectors magnets for bribery. Merchants slipped coins into sleeves, begging inspectors to overlook light bolts. Overseers begged for leniency when quotas weren't met. Some inspectors grew rich on bribes, while others fell victim to accusations of corruption. Court records mention scandals where entire shipments of silk were rejected abroad because of flaws. Back home, inspectors were blamed, investigated, punished, sometimes executed. A single knotted thread could become a political disaster. The stakes were high because silk was not only money, it was diplomacy. Bolts of Tang silk traveled the Silk Road to Persia, India, Byzantium, and beyond. Foreign rulers judged the empire by its gifts. A flawless bolt was a sign of power, a flawed one, a sign of weakness. Inspectors in their dull workshops were unknowingly part of international politics. A rejected tribute shipment could insult a king, strain alliances, even provoke conflict. And yet, to the inspector, it was just another number in a ledger, another bolt to weigh. The Tang court demanded impossible quantities of silk. Provinces were taxed in bolts. Soldiers were paid in bolts. Temples demanded bolts for offerings. Inspectors were tasked with ensuring not only quality but quantity. Weavers, exhausted, often cut corners. Inspectors, pressured to meet quotas, sometimes approved cloth that fell short of standards. The cycle was vicious. The empire demanded perfection, the workshops delivered exhaustion, and the inspectors stood between them, blame from both sides. In some cases, inspectors themselves became political pawns. Rival factions at court used silk shipments as weapons. If a rival's province delivered flawed silk, inspectors' reports were paraded before the emperor as proof of incompetence. Thus, inspectors were not simply bureaucrats of cloth. Their ledgers became ammunition in the endless battles of Tang politics. A line of ink in a silk report could topple a governor's career. In this way, weaving inspectors were silent diplomats. They never left the workshop, never crossed the deserts of the Silk Road, but their judgments traveled across continents. A clean report meant peace. A careless one risked embarrassment abroad. Their boredom was a foundation of the empire's reputation. Their ledgers, dull and repetitive, carried more weight than they ever realized. But silk, like all monopolies, could not last forever. Corruption spread, weavers suffered, and rivals on the Silk Road began producing fine fabrics of their own. Silk had raised the Tang dynasty to brilliance, shimmering bolts flowing out of Chang'an like rivers of wealth. Inspectors' ledgers had guarded quality, their measurements turning fragile threads into imperial currency. But no empire lasts forever, and neither did the monopoly of Tang silk. By the late Tang period, cracks appeared. Internal rebellions disrupted the weaving workshops. Provincial governors, desperate for revenue, siphoned off bolts before they reached the capital. Silk, once reserved for tribute, was sold privately to merchants. Inspectors, caught in the middle, were overwhelmed. Foreign powers, once dazzled by Tang silk, began producing their own. Central Asia, Persia, even Byzantium developed skilled weaving industries. The Chinese monopoly on silk frayed. The inspector's obsession with perfection could no longer hide the truth. Tang silk was no longer unique. As the empire weakened, pressure on weavers only grew. Quotas remained high, punishments harsher, inspectors stricter. Women bent over looms until fingers bled, only to see their work confiscated for minor flaws. Some inspectors, themselves facing ruin if shipments failed, turned cruel. Others turned corrupt, approving cloth in exchange for bribes. Trust in the system crumbled. What had once been an empire of elegance became an empire of exhaustion. For centuries, weaving inspectors had been feared arbiters of quality. But as disorder spread, their authority collapsed. Who cared for a crooked thread when entire provinces rebelled? Who checked weights when merchants smuggled bolts through mountain passes? By the dynasty's fall, many inspectors were little more than clerks, recording shipments no one enforced. Their ledgers, once weapons of politics and diplomacy, became meaningless scribbles in archives that burned or rotted. And yet, their dull work left a long shadow. The Tang weaving bureaucracy pioneered state quality control, the idea that governments could regulate not only taxes and laws, but even the texture of cloth. Later dynasties inherited the system. So did other empires, from the Ottomans regulating carpets to modern states inspecting factories. Global trade itself owes something to those forgotten men. When merchants trusted a bolt of silk stamped with Tang approval, they reinforced a principle that echoes today, that goods must meet standards certified by inspectors unseen. The inspectors themselves vanished without glory. Their names were lost, their ledgers mostly destroyed. They were never praised like poets or generals. But every bolt of silk that crossed deserts, every robe that dazzled foreign king, carried their unseen fingerprints. Even now, Silk remains a symbol of luxury, but also of order. Fabric woven tight, threads aligned, imperfections hidden. That sense of discipline, of beauty bound by bureaucracy, was their legacy. The Tang inspectors lived lives of boredom, surrounded not by poetry, but by ledgers. They counted, weighed, and rejected. Their judgment seemed small, yet they upheld an empire's reputation. When people picture the Spanish conquest of the Americas, they imagine conquistadors in armor, Aztec gold, and galleons loaded with silver. But for every chest of treasure hauled from the mines of Potosi or Zacatecas, there was a clerk with a quill, bent over a ledger, tallying columns of numbers. Silver was power. It paid for Spain's wars, bought alliances in Europe, and flooded markets across Asia. But power means nothing if it slips through fingers. And so Spain created a sprawling bureaucracy to count, weigh, and audit every bar of silver. In the 16th century, the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia became the richest source of silver the world had ever known. Tens of thousands of indigenous laborers, forced under the meter system, worked in brutal conditions to extract ore from the mountain. But the silver did not travel straight from mine to ship. It passed to the hands of auditors, who recorded production, weighed ingots, and ensured the crown received its quinto real, the royal fifth, a 20% tax on all silver. The mountain may have grown with miners' hammers, but in colonial offices nearby, the quiet or scratching of pens was just as important. Auditors worked in cages reels, royal treasury offices, scattered across the Americas. Each was fortified, guarded, and staffed with scribes, treasurers, and inspectors. Their job was to register every coin and ingot before it could be legally transported. A shipment might arrive, mules carrying chests, soldiers standing guard. The auditors weighed the silver on great scales, checked its purity, stamped it with official marks, and entered it into thick books. The process was monotonous, repeated endlessly, but without it, smuggling would flourish, and the crown's lifeline of revenue would collapse. To the world, Spanish silver was dazzling, pieces of 8 clinking across oceans. To the auditors, it was ink on parchment. Each bar became a number, each number a column, each column a calculation. Their ledgers recorded not only amounts, but origins and destinations. Which mine produced it, which merchant received it, which ship carried it. Bureaucracy stretched its net across an empire. The work was tedious, but it made silver into currency Spain could actually use. Without records, silver was just metal. With records, it became imperial finance. Auditors faced constant suspicion. Merchants accused them of skimming profits. Miners accused them of overtaxing. Crown officials accused them of fraud. Everyone, it seemed, believed someone else was stealing. The Crown sent inspectors to inspect the inspectors, creating layers of oversight that only multiplied the paperwork. Endless reports flowed back to Madrid, where more officials reviewed them, hunting for discrepancies. In truth, corruption was rampant. Silver leaked through smuggling, bribery, and fraud. But the bureaucracy, however flawed, kept enough flowing into the royal coffers to sustain Spain's empire for centuries. What was life like for an auditor? Long hours in dim offices, surrounded by ledgers, scales, and suspicious eyes. Each ingot had to be weighed, stamped, recorded. Each shipment had to be checked against lists. Mistakes could mean accusations of corruption. Success meant nothing more than more shipments tomorrow. They were not heroes of empire, nor were they celebrated. But without their dull vigilance, Spain's silver fleets would have been empty. But the silver boom carried dangers. The more Spain depended on its accountants' ledgers, the more it became vulnerable to shortages, fraud, and inflation. Silver was supposed to flow like blood from the mines of the New World into the arteries of Spain's empire. And in a sense, it did. But blood leaks, and so did silver. Behind the neat columns of the auditor's ledgers lurked smuggling, bribery, and fraud on a scale as vast as the empire itself. The quinto real, the royal fifth, was the official tax on silver. For every 5 bars mined, 1 went straight to the crown. But the other 4, those were where temptation lay. Auditors were supposed to weigh, stamp, and record every piece, ensuring no bar slipped away untaxed. But silver was heavy, the mines were remote, and inspectors were few. A miner could quietly pocket a lump. A mule driver could divert a chest. A treasurer could misplace entire shipments. Auditors tried to keep control with their ledgers. Yet even they were not immune to temptation. Some underweighed shipments. Others recorded false numbers. Others colluded with merchants. Bribes circulated as freely as silver itself. The Spanish crown, aware of this leakage, created a dizzying system of oversight. For every auditor, there was another auditor above him. For every ledger, a duplicate was kept elsewhere. For every report, an inspector was sent to verify. The result was not efficiency, but a paper empire, mountains of ledgers, reports, and counter-reports. In Madrid, officials waded through endless paperwork, searching for fraud that was often hidden in plain sight. Sometimes they found it. Scandals erupted when auditors were caught with unexplained wealth, when ships carried more silver than their books claimed, or when foreign merchants mysteriously acquired untaxed bars. Punishments could be harsh: dismissal, fines, even imprisonment. Yet corruption always returned, because the treasure was too great and the empire too vast. Outside the cage's reels, the royal counting houses, another economy thrived. Smugglers moved silver through mountain passes, onto private ships and into foreign markets. Dutch, English, and Portuguese traders eagerly bought untaxed silver, paying bribe to auditors to look the other way. Entire towns lived on the shadow economy. A ledger might record 100 bars shipped, while 150 were actually mined. The missing 50 traveled in silence, enriching everyone except the crown. For Spain, this leakage was fatal in the long run. It believed itself rich, but much of its silver never reached Madrid. What arrived was quickly spent on wars, while inflation at home hollowed out the economy. For the auditors themselves, life was precarious. Too honest, and they made enemies. Too corrupt, and they risked exposure. Many tried to balance on the thin line between obedience and survival. Imagine sitting in a colonial office in Potosi. Outside, mule trains jingle with silver bars. Miners stumble through the streets. Merchants haggle for shipments. Inside, you scratch numbers into a ledger by candlelight, knowing each figure could condemn you or save you. One miscalculation, one bribe taken, one shipment lost, and your career, perhaps your life, could be over. Their work was monotonous, but the danger was constant. Spain's rulers believed their auditors' ledgers proved their empire's wealth. In reality, the numbers masked fragility. Inflation soared as silver flooded Europe. Industries collapsed, unable to compete with cheaper imports. The crown borrowed recklessly against future shipments, only to discover that treasure ships brought less than expected. The auditors kept counting, but what they counted was an illusion. Mountains of silver that enriched individuals, corrupted officials, and bankrupted the state. Silver filled the ledgers, but the empire's coffers remained strangely empty. Spain was drowning in treasure, yet starving for wealth. For nearly 3 centuries, Spanish auditors in the Americas tallied every bar of silver that poured from the mines. Their ledgers filled vaults as surely as treasure chests did. Yet in the end, their meticulous columns of ink recorded not the triumph of empire, but its fragility. By the 17th century, the flood of silver that once dazzled Europe began to slow. The richest veins of Potosi and Zacatecas were exhausted. Costs of extraction rose as tunnels sank deeper, ventilation worsened, and more mercury was required to refine poor quality ore. Auditors noticed before anyone else. Their ledgers showed shipments shrinking year by year. Where once caravans carried hundreds of bars, now they carried dozens. On paper, the empire's lifeblood was drying, but Madrid ignored the warnings. Wars in Europe still demanded treasure. Debts still had to be paid. The pressure on auditors only grew harsher. As production declined, corruption flourished. To meet quotas, officials inflated numbers. Ledgers recorded bars that did not exist, while smuggled silver flowed outside official channels. Auditors became trapped between truth and survival. Report honestly, and they angered their superiors. Report optimistically, and they fed illusions. In many cases, they chose illusions. The books continued to show wealth even as ships arrived lighter, markets faltered, and Spain's credit collapsed. The auditors' pens, once guardians of order, became tools of denial. By the 18th century, Spain's dominance was crumbling. Rival powers, England, France, the Netherlands, built industries and navies with silver siphoned through smuggling or trade. Spain, meanwhile, remained addicted to imported goods, its own economy hollowed out by dependence on treasure. When colonial revolts erupted in the Americas in the early 19th century, the silver auditors' role all but ended. The cage's reels were abandoned, their ledgers scattered or burned. The empire's bureaucratic machinery of silver, once so feared, dissolved into dust. What became of the auditors themselves? Few are remembered. Their names appear only in scattered trial records, payroll lists, or denunciations of corruption. They were never celebrated like conquistadors, never glorified like explorers. And yet, their work shaped the world. They created one of the first truly global financial systems, a network of records, checks, and audits stretching across oceans. They proved that wealth is not only mined and minted, but written, weighed, and accounted for. Modern accounting owes something to these forgotten clerks. Their insistence on duplicate ledgers, cross-checks, and verification laid foundation for auditing practices still used today. The double-entry bookkeeping spreading from Italy to Spain found its harshest test in the New World silver. Even the failures left lessons. Spain's collapse showed that treasure without industry, record without reform, cannot sustain a nation. The auditors' ledgers became cautionary tales for future empires. Stand in the ruins of Potosi today, where tunnels collapse and the mountains still bleed silver. Imagine the mule caravans, the guarded chests, the endless columns of ink in dim offices. The treasure is gone. The empire is gone. But the boredom of those clerks, the act of weighing, counting, recording, remains alive every time a modern accountant opens a ledger. Spain's silver empire glittered in galleons and dazzled courts, but its true story lay in ledgers. Its glory was written in ink, its decline in numbers that no one wanted to believe. The great library of Alexandria was long gone by the Middle Ages, but its spirit lived on, not in grand marble halls, but in small, drafty rooms filled with monks, parchment, and endless copying. Across Europe and the Middle East, manuscript keepers became the quiet guardians of civilization. They were not philosophers, not kings, not warriors. They were scribes, librarians, men, and occasionally women, who spent their lives surrounded by silence, dust, and ink. Their job was not invention, but preservation. They copied, cataloged, and stored manuscripts, ensuring that ancient texts did not vanish into oblivion. Their lives were monotonous, but without them, entire civilizations' memories would have been lost. The heart of preservation in medieval Europe was the monastery. In stone buildings lit by narrow windows, monks hunched over desks, copying manuscripts by candlelight. Some worked in silence. Others whispered prayers as they wrote. Hours passed in monotony. Black ink for the main text, red ink for headings, gold leaf for holy words. The task was grueling. Parchment had to be scraped smooth, ink carefully mixed, quills trimmed to sharp points. A slip of the hand meant hours wasted. Some manuscripts bear the margin notes of weary scribes. This parchment is bad. It is cold in here. Oh, for a drink of ale. Yet their boredom preserved the wisdom of antiquity. Aristotle, Virgil, Augustine, the Bible. Without their monotony, the past would have vanished. But copying was only half the task. Libraries had to be organized, and this was the work of manuscript keepers. They cataloged collections, chained precious books to desks to prevent theft, and enforced rules for borrowing. In monasteries, abbots appointed keepers to track who used which book. Some catalogs survive, lists of titles painstakingly written, often with notes on condition, a little worm-eaten, missing 2 leaves. These records, dull and bureaucratic, are the reason we know which works existed in which libraries. In the Islamic world, too, librarians flourished. Baghdad's House of Wisdom gathered Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, translated into Arabic. Here, librarians were scholars as well as keepers, but their daily work still involved endless inventories, copying, and cataloging. Books were rare and fragile. A library might hold only a few dozen volumes. Parchment could rot, ink could fade, fire or damp could destroy everything. Librarians lived with constant anxiety. One accident, and centuries of knowledge might vanish. And accidents happened. Fires, floods, raids, and neglect wiped out countless manuscripts. Some librarians tried desperately to save what they could, smuggling books into hiding or copying them frantically before disaster struck. But most simply endured the slow decay, patching and binding as best they could. Few names of these keepers survive. They left no monuments, no fame, yet their invisible labor bridged worlds. The texts they preserved allowed the Renaissance to flourish centuries later. Their dusty catalogs, their endless copying, their boredom, these are the threads that tied the Middle Ages to the ancient world and the ancient world to us. But knowledge is power, and power breeds conflict. Libraries were not always havens. They were battlegrounds. Books were stolen, censored, even burned by the very people meant to protect them. Books are fragile, but in the Middle Ages they were also dangerous. To preserve a text was to grant it life. To suppress one was to erase it from memory. And so the manuscript keepers, seemingly humble custodians of parchment and ink, became quiet arbiters of what knowledge would survive and what would be lost forever. In monasteries, abbots and librarians decided which books were worth copying. Many ancient works of pagan philosophy, Roman literature, or early science were deemed unworthy, even harmful. Instead, resources were spent on scripture, theology, and approved commentaries. As a result, whole branches of classical knowledge disappeared, not because they were burned in some spectacular fire, but because librarians chose not to copy them. Neglect, in its own way, was as powerful as flames. Yet sometimes, scraps of forbidden text survived hidden inside others. Parchment was expensive, so old manuscripts were scraped and reused. Today, scholars uncover faint traces of erased texts. Pagan plays, lost histories, scientific treatises, ghosts beneath the surface of approved words. Books were precious, and theft was constant. Manuscript keepers chained volumes to desks, marked them with ownership stamps, and excommunicated thieves. Yet manuscripts still vanished. A traveling scholar might borrow a volume and never return it. Rival monasteries might steal texts from each other, justifying it as divine will. Stories abound amongst sneaking books under their robes, of noble patrons demanding volumes on loan that were never seen again. Librarians filed complaints, but once a manuscript was gone, it was usually gone for good. Theft, though destructive, sometimes saved text too. A stolen book might escape a later fire, ending up in a distant library where it survived by chance. Thus, the history of knowledge was shaped by petty act of greed as much as by deliberate preservation. Of course, fire remained the great destroyer. Candle flames, lightning, or raids could wipe out entire collections in hours. Monks wrote laments over lost libraries, mourning not just parchment but centuries of memory.